All right. Hello, everybody. Well, I first went to Swindon Oasis in 1977 as a student. I was at Bristol University, and I designed my first pool.
Hello, everybody.
Immediately on a visit to this.
I first went to Swindon
actually
Oasis
was a dome.
in 1977
with
as a student,
fellow colleagues
at
at
university.
and I designed
somewhat
my
smaller
scale
flat.
on this one, but so it's actually quite important to me as a building which is sort of effectively started my career as a sports and leisure architect. The building itself was designed by Clifford Barnett and Partners, of which Peter Sargent and Mark Pateriadis both became partners. Peter was a partner at this stage. I don't believe Mark was, but I believe that he worked on this project along with a number of others, which I'll come on to. So next slide, please. Right. The building looked pretty similar to what it does now. It's a dome which covers the leisure pool and a rectangular building which houses what originally the bowls, squash courts and sports hall with a linking building between. The slight change, there's been a recovering of the dome with some form of flat panel. The original covering was a series of slight domed perspex covers. They became very corroded, as it were, on the outside and turned white from the translucence that they were originally. I believe also it was single glazed originally, effectively, and now has got some degree of insulation. The next slide. This is a more recent photograph which shows at some stage, in 1970, the building was opened in 1976. In 1980, let's see, I started 86, I believe the flumes were added, and they're quite an important feature to it. We go to the next slide, please. Internally, it's a large open space. I've been trying to find domes built in the 20th century in the UK, and frankly, I can't find any. There are some later buildings which you could say were domes, which are the Welsh National Garden by Norman Foster and the Eden Centre by Grimshaw's, but they're not quite the same sort of integrity as this one, as a pure dome. I'd say it continues a sort of a trend of providing domes which effectively died out. It's a very efficient way of enclosing a large space, and it's sort of it embodies sort of a style of building which was effectively invented by Gillinson Barnett and another practice called Thornton Browns. And it's quite an important part of later cultural life in the 20th century. Another slide, please. There aren't actually a concise history of this type of building. The best are two books, one called Great Lengths and the other called Liquid Assets, published by English Heritage, under the editorship of Simon Inglis, who has covered certainly the older buildings and the and Lidos, and there are examples of leisure pools in the old Handbook of Sports and Recreation building, which is no longer published. But the reality is there's no concise history from about 1970 to present day of this type of building. Next slide, please. So they weren't at the time covered particularly well in architectural magazines. The sort of the whole type that certainly that Gillinson Barnett did. There are, as far as I'm aware, no records of those in architectural magazines or books from the time. This is an article from Design Magazine, which talks about one of the other buildings that they did. which is at the Herringthorpe Leisure Centre in Rotherham, which is also demolished. It's quite an important article in terms of actually getting the use of this over. And the principal part of it is that it was a recreational building and not a sports building. So sports was regarded at the time as being very elitist, that sports buildings were for very few people. And what the intention behind all of these buildings was to make them more accessible to the general public, to families, and actually to women. A lot of women did not use the pools or the sports facilities that were available, and this was to try and encourage everybody to use them. The next slide, please. Having said that, this photograph shows a man with a baby in a wave pool, and they all had wave pools. They were so again, it was a new type of technology. This article actually goes on to describe how waves are made, and it's something which we don't actually build that many wave pools again now, principally because they're quite expensive to operate. If we just go to the next slide, please. This is a family tree, which I don't know whether it'll be interesting to people, but it is to me. I'm on it. Gillis and Barnett actually spawned a number of different practices, which have spawned further practices. And actually, if you look at the names of some of the people on here, Limbrick Roberts, GT3, Space and Place, LA Architects, Savile Jones, B3, they're all architects which are currently the principal providers of design for sports and leisure buildings in the UK. There's one practice missing, which is Faulkner Brown's. Faulkner Brown's does not have this tree at all. It has themselves at the top, and they've not really spawned any other architects. Clifford Barnett himself was quite a controversial character. He, I believe, was struck off the architectural register for being a director of a building company, that being Clifford Barnett Developments, which designed and built sports and leisure projects, and used some of the other architects on here. So Charles Smith and Will Alsop at one stage. Other companies, EWA, have also done quite a number of sports projects. So, next slide, please. So all of the projects from the 70s, with the exception of Swindon, have been demolished. Not a single one of them survives. This is actually by Faulkner Brown's, which was, I believe, tried to be listed, and indeed should have been. It's sort of an extremely good example of the type of building. Next slide, please. And again, as you'll see, the wave pool, the integration of a beach, the palm trees, all sort of new in the sort of late 60s and early 70s when these buildings were built. People weren't going on; they were just starting to go on holidays to Spain. So they'd seen the sort of exotic locations, and they could go and visit them if they visited these centres. One of the reasons why Swindon should be listed is that it is the last example that could be saved. It's actually probably one of the best ones. This and Bletchley were the two which are really well worth saving, which sort of display this typology. Next slide, please. Another one which has recently gone was Rill Sun Centre. It's not particularly great building, but in terms of its use, it sort of had it had a surf pool in it. Sorry, next slide, please. So it had surfing inside it, which is something which wasn't done again until sort of very late and using completely different sorts of technologies. Next slide, please. One of the largest which was done was at Sunderland. This is the Crowtree Leisure Centre. Again, sort of a major building in the centre of Sunderland, and now sadly demolished. Next slide, please. That again, you'll see the wave pool, all very similar sort of things, but all completely different to anywhere else. The UK were market leaders in this. They weren't. There was nobody else doing these in particular at this particular time. once after this period, there was a big growth of them as external water parks in the United States.
And market leaders in this.
The technology went over. There was nobody else doing it. They started building leisure centres
particular time,
some of which displayed the same sort of characteristics. After this period, there was a big growth of them.
This is a report
from external water parks in the United States. Recreation officer of Swindon Council, and it's a really actually quite a fascinating report to read. It's been sort of photographed from the Swindon archives by the Saves Oasis Swindon, and this I think is sort of we've gone a full circle from what this says, is which talks about the distinction between this being a leisure centre rather than a sports centre, and that it's for family use and sport, and that what's happened is that by opening this up to everybody, so you get a wider participation, that sports have grown themselves, and now sports have very much taken over this, and local authorities have sort of lost the desire to provide things like leisure pools, which are regarded as just fun. Next slide, please. So if we go into, we've got a series of slides here coming up which show the design of it. Again, they're in the Swindon archives. I think the sort of, I know a lot of drawing work and design work for these buildings have been lost. We certainly don't, I didn't have lots from the work that I've been on, but they show the development, they show the integration of the sport and the leisure. And this is sort of pretty close to how it was built. If we keep going through these, it's sort of so the next one shows the obviously the circular, the fun bit, and then the more rectangular thing for the courts, the bowling greens and the squash courts. It wasn't quite built like this, but this shows a pretty good intent of how it was conceived. So next slide, please. The pool, again, it's not quite built like this, but these are drawings from 1972. So they're some years before it was fully opened. It did include the swimming lane, so it has a swimming lanes within the wave pool itself. And I think that's another important feature. Actually, I think the listing should actually include the wave pool as well. I think it's not just the dome and the rest of it. It's the part of the interior. Now, I'm not saying it should be kept completely as it is, because one of the philosophies that certainly Peter Sargent, who was, whilst he was a partner at Gillis and Barnett, headed up where they set up a specialist sports unit, as a leisure unit called the Leisure Design Unit, which researched and developed these sort of ideas. So next slide, please. So that they looked at how you could sort of get more use out of these buildings. So anyway, so going on to the design of this, it was obviously conceived as a dome. These are pretty early. These aren't the drawings that it was built from. The sports part of it looks to be a brick-built building in this one, whereas in the end it was a panel building. But the dome obviously is an integral part of its concept, and is pretty much very similar to what's drawn here. Next slide, please. A section on it, again conceived with the trees in it, lots of planting, and the pools. Next, please. I'm just looking at the detail of it. It's really quite an interesting drawing, architectural drawing. Drawing a dome at the time, it's all drawn by hand. It's a reasonable representation of it, and it's an excellent drawing. This was a diving pool. The diving was seen as another activity which could be promoted, as in diving, underwater diving, as opposed to high board diving. Next slide, please. And then just a view of the elevation. And next slide, please. And the building, whilst it's being constructed, a concrete structure, a fairly lightweight steel, aluminium structure, I believe it is, for the roof, which was a proprietary system brought in from the States, I believe, but I don't know too much about it. Right, so one of the issues about all of, sorry, next slide, please, is the use of this building. It apparently gave the name to the band Oasis, which I find fascinating, who played in this multi-use sports hall, and they had a different name prior to arriving, and they changed to Oasis. Right, this is one of the buildings which I have been responsible for the design of. You'll see, it's actually in some ways very similar. It's a round building, a link building, and then a rectangular building. This one, in fact, houses a leisure pool, the reception area, and then a 50-metre pool. So next slide, please. But what it does actually, sorry, yeah, I don't want to do this one. Some of the rides within here. This one actually has again a wave pool. Doesn't have any lane swimming in this one because it's well catered for the 50-metre pool. But it does have some of the rides which I think are worth looking at to include within Swindon Oasis as it develops. This one has a ride called a Master Blaster, which goes up and down. So it uses jetted water to actually propel you up and down. And it could fit within the space of the dome. Next slide, please. This is the International Pool in Cardiff. Next slide, please. And then this one was originally designed to house many more rides than are currently built. You'll see the platform at the top can take a lot more, and actually encompass quite a lot of the design philosophy that Peter Sargent, Mark Patiriadis had, in that they wanted these buildings to change. They didn't want them to stay the same, but the buildings themselves would encompass everything that needed to be done within in the future. So next slide, please. So this is another one. It's this which I designed in Lisbon in Northern Ireland. This has been changed quite a bit since I did it, and it includes facilities for younger children, smaller slides. Again, they could all be put within this same building. They could all be used to improve its the number of people who would want to go and visit it, and make it that much more and that much more of a financial success, or less of a financial burden than it currently is. Next slide, please. This is an alteration to the coral reef, which they've added a whole range of new rides. They could easily do this at Swindon. It wouldn't alter the integrity of the structure or the purity of the design that's there. It could be in place of the flumes that were added at a later date. Next, please. The same thing has been done at another building. This was actually done, I believe, by Clifford Barney Developments. This is the Sandcastle in Blackpool, where lots of changes have been made over the years to it, and additional rides added. The difficulty we have over this is that quite a lot of what's sort of incorporated into these is sort of it will come and go, and it's very transitional and made of materials which just don't last. So keeping what's there, I think, is actually quite important. I think it's a building of note. I think had it been done by perhaps a different architect, it might well be that much more secure. So that's my talk. I commend people to try and support the listing of this building to preserve it.
Right. Thank you very much, Robert, for covering a building that's so topical. And I know there's a very active local campaign, and that C20 are involved nationally as well. So it's very good to see more about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.